Hello, this is Clyde from Africa Media Australia. Thank you very much for those of you who watch Afroshine live and who comment and who contact us to encourage us about this show. As you know, it's all about talking about issues, challenges, and opportunities in relation to African communities. We want to give, actually, to put a specific emphasis on the success, the educational, leadership, and entrepreneurship excellence in our community. But from time to time, when there are issues that affect us, overall, we would want to highlight those and have meaningful discussions that can help us to make progress in the community. Tonight, I'll be talking with three guests. They're all Sydney based. And they're all will be talking with me about the George Floyd incident and what has ensued from that, which is the Black Lives Matter movement. And what does that mean for our communities here in Australia? Last time I had a chance to speak to guests from Victoria. Tonight is with guests from New South Wales. So let me introduce them, or ask them to introduce themselves. I'll start with Niben. Please introduce yourself. I know you've been on our show before. It was just a voice. Now we have a face we can put onto that voice. Tell us a bit more about who you are and what you do.
So first of all, I just want to apologize for the lighting. This is the best that you're going to get today, so roll with me. So I'm a researcher at the University of Sydney, focusing on women, peace and security. And my background is in social science, majoring in politics and international relations, and I have a master's in international law. Basically, I would say I'm just a concerned African citizen, so I seem to find myself busybodying in all these movements, and yeah, that's who I am.
Good, thank you. Cholok, please tell us about yourself.
Hi everybody. So my name is Cholok Dutgum. Based in Sydney. Qualified primary school teacher. Though I have not been in the classroom for the past 9 years because of family commitments. Worked as an interpreter. I have been in Australia for 20 years, so I've seen a lot of evolvement. Thank you for having me as a guest on your show. As Niven said, she's a concerned citizen, but I am a mother of 4 girls who were born in Australia. So that is my role and that is my concern.
Okay, thank you very much, Cholok. Mary, tell us more about yourself.
My name is Mary Jo Kamara. I'm originally from Sierra Leone. I arrived in Australia as a refugee in 2008, and I was in Lismore.
If you can speak up a little bit, your sound is a bit faint. If you
I
speak
was
up a
in
little.
Lismore I was in Lismore in a country town. So I moved to Sydney because of uni and and family members. So I've worked in the community for a while. I've been involved in a lot of activism in the African community. I've been a leader for the African Youth Association of New South Wales. I've been part of the Sierra Leone community. I've worked with a lot of African leaders. We've met with a lot of politicians about discussing issues that are affecting Africans in New South Wales. I am a social worker by profession and I'm a law student.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. Now, let me just say a quick word for our viewers, those watching us. Please, as usual, we'll ask you to tell us where you're watching us from, just to make a quick comment to tell us where you're watching us from. And also, we welcome your comments and questions you may have. We will actually get the guests to address some of those comments. And if you want to even come live through video to make a comment, we can send you a link and make that happen. So, as I said earlier, we're talking about the Black Lives Matter movement. Of course, it's something that is started in the US, but is spreading everywhere. And there's been a number of protests in Australia in relation to that. My question is Black Lives Matter movement the same in US as it is in Australia? Are we talking about the same thing? Maybe let me start with you, Niben.
Thank you for starting with me. So at this point, I would say that it's impossible for it to be the exact same movement, although a lot of the issues that Black people face globally, which is white supremacy. And I think that the movement has evolved to include issues that are very specific to Australia, which include Indigenous rights. And that the centering of Indigenous rights in this movement is what makes it slightly different than BLM. Obviously, the US has its history with its Black population, but Australia also has its history to reckon with, not only with new African migrants, but Indigenous populations that have had to suffer untold atrocities through this system and continue to suffer systemic discrimination at this point. So it's not the same, although there are a lot of overlaps.
Thank you. Cholo, what do you make of it?
I think I would have to agree with Nyabeng. I don't think the movement is the same as the US and the UK in Australia. I believe the shift is in the Indigenous people of Australia, and also the population that has also joined them, being us, the Native Africans who have been here for over 20 years. That's the dynamic that we add to this movement. And I think the rise and the motivation is coming from the fact that we Africans, I think, are feeling it. And I think that is what's encouraging the Indigenous people and standing by them. That's what makes this movement a bit different to what it is in America and the UK, as it stands out.
Yep, Mary, agree or disagree?
I will agree with both speakers that this is it's quite different from the US movement, even though they are interlapped. And of course, the movement ignited because of the solidarity that we have. For
The
what's
sound is
happening
still
in
quite
the
low,
USA.
Mary. I'm not sure why. If maybe you can.
Hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, but just we can hardly hear you. But yeah, see if we can speak up a little, if that's going to help.
The movement, of course, it's not totally the same because of we have a very unique situation in Australia. We always recommend that our country is very multicultural, but our past history is telling us that something is happening here that is quite different to other countries. The history of, if you examine the history of Aboriginal people, so it makes it completely different from what's happening in the United States. But I believe that because of this, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Go ahead.
Yeah. So, but I believe that we have, of course, we have similar history, and for us as migrants, African Australians as well, we've shared common interests because we are Black. We have brothers and sisters in overseas or in the United States who have experienced racism, and we have the same interest here. So I believe at some point this will happen in Australia. So we need to rise up now. So it's good that the awareness is raising.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Now, when we talk about Black Lives Matter in the Australian context, it kind of more connects, or at least in some minds, with the history of the Aborigines, and less more about that and less about Africans in Australia. What your view about that, Nabin?
Sorry, I missed the end part of your question. Could you repeat that?
Yeah, I'm saying that the connotation that is linked to Black Lives Matter in Australia, in the Australian context, is more about the Aboriginal community rather than the African community. What your take? What's your take on that?
I think that it necessarily has to be about both. I think the reason that we are focusing on Indigenous rights is from something I remember from my father a long time ago. He told me that if they don't even treat the Indigenous population, the Black population in this country, in a way that is humane and in a way that is respectful, who are you as a Black woman from Africa to expect fair treatment? Now, this was a harsh reality to hear from my father when I was 16 years old, after having just had an encounter with a police officer that was based on pure racism. And so the notion is, if Indigenous Australians are not empowered in their own country, in their own land, there is not very much hope for recently arrived African migrants to expect much better treatment from the system. And the system has reflected this. If we look at the fact that the rates of arrest and incarceration among Indigenous Australians, as well as African Australians, they are almost they're becoming almost on par. And what that says is that there is an anti-Black sort of systemic view that permeates all Australian institutions. And so it is about Indigenous rights, but Indigenous rights is everybody's rights. If the Indigenous Australians aren't given a perspective where they feel that they are valued, that they are empowered, and that the systems in their own country work for their favor, then no black person, no immigrant really of any hue darker than a tan can expect treatment that would be considered respectful. And it goes hand in hand in a way, because Australia also has a long history, a proud history of black resistance. If we looked at the 1964 freedom rides, when Indigenous Australians fought for their right to be allowed to vote, when they tried to remove things like carrying papers to explain why they were in the street. These are all things that are systemic parts of apartheid regimes, as well as anti-black regimes. And so it's a story that's intertwined, although there are unique things that make it different. The uniqueness is Australia is a settler colonial country. The colonialists never left. They settled, and the Indigenous population just had to basically adapt to what was happening to them, and they were subjected to systemic issues all the way through from the first fleet to now that continue to permeate. If you look in places like in the United States and even in Africa, the dynamics are slightly different. African Americans were brought to the US as slaves. They were taken away as slaves. Again, that is a totally different argument in a way that permeates the way in which we approach these issues. With African Americans, you can look at it from the perspective of they were promised an enfranchisement after the Emancipation Proclamation. They were promised equal rights. They were promised, equal treatment under the law. And here we sit after Reconstruction, after the Civil War, after all these things, where there isn't much change that you can say that is substantive. The changes have been on the face. They get told you had a black president, you should be happy. But one black president among 45 says nothing about what's happening in the US. In Australia, we are still celebrating one Indigenous person being elected to Parliament. That's a huge, huge thing that needs to be spoken about. And I think there's a reason that it has to be about Indigenous lives, because if Indigenous people aren't empowered, then we have no chance, essentially.
All right, thank you. Cholok, is living black the same for an African Australian than it is for an Indigenous Australian?
I think it's what you've been said and more. I think my take on this is to give you examples of things that I have seen, things that I have witnessed in our community that, shows that it's not much difference. A certain 16-year-old had to go through a court case, and so when for something he did not commit, eventually he was given 1 year good behavior bond. What the lawyer had pulled me aside and said, because the lawyer was not necessarily of a British background, he pulled me aside and reminded me that, look, you are at the bottom of this ladder, along with the Indigenous group. I'm just letting you know that this is what's going to happen in 6 weeks' time. When he turns 18, they will come looking for him. And that's exactly what happened. 6 weeks I counted, and they came to look for him. So that just reiterates the fact that we are not much different in terms of how we are being treated. And I think that's where the fight has come in, and that's why you've seen a lot of representation on the street. On my personal level as a teacher, I've gone out back, New South Wales, and reading the history of that area is where, there's a swimming pool in town there, where Indigenous people were not allowed to swim. That really, I was dumbfounded by that. And it's where they had to show, the cards to show the percentage of their blackness in order to allow them into certain places, just like the apartheid system. And so these two examples are really a reminder of how we are really not much different to how the Indigenous people are living. And something has to change. And I think this movement is just the beginning in Australia to bring about that kind of change.
Yep, Maria, you got a take on that?
Of course, we are not. I don't think we're different from the Aboriginal people, the way they treat them. First, we have to examine the things that have happened to Aboriginal people in the past. For example, if we look at the death in custody, and you look at how many Aboriginal people have died in custody, and these things have not been reported. And from some articles that I've been reading, it's even hard to get those reports. So imagine if these things are happening to Africans. So it will be difficult to challenge, because we are, of course, not represented in the media. We are not represented. We don't have representative in politics. So we'll experience the same thing that Aboriginals are experiencing. If you look at the custody rate, the percentage of young Aboriginal men that are in custody is very high compared to non-Indigenous people. So these same things will happen to Africans in the future. So it means that we'll experience the same thing. And of course, recently we saw what happened in Melbourne. The way the media portrayed the whole issue, it's completely different from when these things happen to, or when these things happen in a white society. So we have to be cautious of this, that we'll get the same experience as Aboriginal people. As a young black man, the way the police will treat me will completely different from the way they will treat white people. As a community leader who have worked with young black people, from the listening to their experience or their connection with the police is not that great. Of course, it's not the same as other countries like in America, but it's not great at all. So these are things that we have to work on.
All right. Now, as African Australians, obviously we are concerned by the Black Lives Matter movement. We would like to be able to, see change in terms of the interactions between the broader society, not just the police force, the broader society, and us as people of color. Now, the whole movement has been happening for quite some time, with the George Floyd incident accelerating things. Where we are now, do you see any hope in the Australian context for any significant change? If so, explain, or if not, what should we do to facilitate more change in this space? Yeah, go ahead, Yvonne.
Yeah, I think if you'd asked me this question last week, I might have had a different answer. And this week, it's a totally different answer because it's an evolving situation. Now, as of today, the amount of articles that I read on the ABC about racial incidents around Australia and around the world, what is really disheartening is reading the comment sections. Now, what I realize is that in Australia, we still have a very strong culture of denialism. We deny the existence of racism because to admit it would be to admit that there are privileges that were accrued to people based on their skin color and nothing more. And so what we have is accusations of this is fake outrage, this is an American issue, or, this is just being blown out of proportion. Now, of course, I'm not saying Facebook comments are representative of the whole country, but what they are is a microcosm of the attitudes that are still outside in most Australian societies. So I'm brought to this situation that happened to a prominent human rights activist and lawyer, Nyadol Nwan. She went on Q&A to discuss the Black Lives Matter movement, where she was a guest with Nakia Louie and some other Indigenous guests at the time. And so she spoke out about the treatment of Indigenous Australians. She spoke out about the treatment of Black people in Australia. And within a week, I have her on my Facebook, as a friend on Facebook. Somebody had created a campaign with people who would come to troll her page. Avi Yemeni, a prominent right-wing white supremacist, or whatever you want to call him, had created a video, basically a character assassination of Nyadol Nwan, saying that, she has a brother who's a criminal, so how dare she speak about BLM, that she's just here to stir up racism and all of this. Now, all of his followers went onto her page and carried out a campaign of harassment that was horrific to watch, calling her names, using racial epithets and all of this. And just, I think a couple of days ago, one of these people was found out to be a South Australian police officer who sent her a message calling her the N-word, calling her a C-word, a very sexist language, and telling her to go back to the jungle she came from. This is a police officer from South Australia who participated in this. And now, okay, individuals in an organization don't represent the whole organization. But my disappointment was the police commissioner of South Australia came out and said that this does not reflect a culture of racism in the Australian police force. This was one bad apple, that this was one bad person, and he's not representative of the whole system, and that it's unfair to say that Australia has a racism problem or that the police force has a racism problem. Now, you can't fix a problem where time and time again, when you show evidence, you get told that that's not enough evidence, that this problem doesn't exist, that this is a one-off case. Now, what they do by individualizing racism is that they remove collective responsibility from their institutions and from their governments and from their society. So everyone can say, if it's not me, then it's not an issue. And so what we have is, when I say, do we have hope for this? What we need is a giant cultural shift. And unless we have that, unless Indigenous voices aren't constantly shut down, unless activists like Nyadol Nwan can go and speak about an issue that affects her and other people directly and not come back to face a barrage of abuse, I can't say that I see much really changing or that I have much hope in the immediate time in Australia. Of course, there's no such thing as hopelessness, so there is hope at some point. But as it currently stands, we even just have to convince people that the problem exists. Like, that is the barrier that we face.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Cholo, there's a lot of responsibility that we have to bear in terms of facilitating or encouraging or fighting for change in this space. Where do you see that we should direct energy into to get this done?
I think as an African community, it starts within the homes, and how you approach it in your home and how you discuss this in your home is what will bring it to life outside, and how you address it with your children, for example, teenagers and the younger children that are coming up. And then that will carry through outside into their education, and it will carry out into their workplaces. But eventually, as a bigger shift, I've been really, I've lost hope in a way that I've actually stepped back and to just let it take place naturally. But I'm hoping that there will be policies, because changes are only applied through legislation, policies, and bills that get passed. Until we can get past the convincing of that this problem exists, I don't know. I don't see where this is going to take place and when it's going to take place anytime soon in Australia. And that's I've lost hope as a mother. That's where I stand, and I think a lot of families are probably like that as well. But eventually, change is inevitable, and it will happen, whether those people like it or not. It will happen.
Okay, Mary, you can change the laws, but
Yeah.
racism is more in the psychology. Obviously, changing the law helps, but it doesn't necessarily change the way people think and perceive others in the society. What from your experience, young person living in Sydney with your experience working in the community, what are the sort of things we should consider to accelerate that change in the minds and the perceptions of people in the way they relate with people of color?
Well, I think if that change is coming, the first step should be our politicians, our community leaders. So when I looked at the Royal Commission for Death in Custody report in 1991 to what's happening now, I think the change is not coming because it's hardly been implemented or partially been implemented, some of the reports from that commission. So one may question why is that happening? If it's happening to Aboriginal people, of course it will happen to the African community. So again, when I look at the Melbourne case last year or so, the few years, I listened to reports or discussions from politicians in the media. You have to question again if we are in a multicultural society. So that means the change is not coming. So we've seen that politicians were feeling racial disparities between races in Australia. So that's again question that, of course, the change is not coming. And if I examine my experience talking to people in African community, I know a lot of young people are always angry. They're angry because community leaders are not stepping up to bring that change.
Okay.
Can you hear me? Community leaders
yeah,
are
we
not
can hear you.
stepping up to bring that change. So it's something that should come first from our politicians, and the media also has a role to play in bringing about that change. So especially the mainstream media, we've seen a lot of reports coming from the media. It doesn't help the situation at all. When we look at the Black Lives Matter movement, when it started in Australia, we saw comments from people in the media. It was completely different from what the movement is portraying. So I mean, if that change should come, it should come from the higher level. I believe the higher level, the politicians, the media, will be able to shape the society we live. I've been talking to a lot of people, and sometimes it's easy to say, yes, Australia is not racist. Then you have to question those people. question their interaction with African people, their interaction with migrants. When I came to Australia, I was lucky to live in Lismore, in a community where the percentage of Aboriginal people is very high. And I studied social work. And social work is about social change. I was taught about the history of Australia. I examined the Australian social policy and look at it from a different part, from an African perspective. Let us ask this question. How many Australians have studied the history of indigenous people? How many Australians understand what minorities are suffering in Australia, or what the minority groups are experiencing in Australia? The percentages is very small. So if we want to bring that change, I think we have to be acceptable, accept that this is a multicultural society. We have communities that are not getting the same experience. We have communities that are in the lower gap. Those communities, we have to lift them up, and to lift those communities up, we have to work with them. We have to understand how they feel. We have to understand their daily experiences, and we don't understand that as a society.
Okay.
So if we want to bring
talking of leadership, go ahead.
Can I just add to what Murray has cleverly said here, which is about to what degree do we know Australian Indigenous history? Look at Prime Minister Morrison's comments last week about saying that there was no slavery in Australia. Australia hadn't had any slaves. Now that shows a complete and insensitive disregard for Aboriginal history. We had what they called blackbirding, where they would take Pacific Islanders from around Australia, from islands around Australia, and employ them on sugarcane fields with no money and no working conditions. What is that but the definition of slavery? We still till today are discussing stolen wages from Aboriginal workers around in the outback on farms for generations. What is it when you work without money, if not slavery? So just because Australia didn't go to, West Africa and take slaves on ships does not mean that the treatment that they gave Indigenous Australians and Pacific Islanders and Torres Strait Islanders could not be defined as slavery. Now, when he was corrected on this, instead of saying, this is an opportunity for me to learn more, he then goes into semantics and said, well, I meant that there was no slavery in New South Wales. Now, we weren't talking about slavery in New South Wales specifically. We were talking about Australia. And what happened in Queensland and far north Queensland is Australian Indigenous history. So his first instinct, when corrected, a good leader would say, I apologize, I was insensitive to this population and that I should maybe do better. Instead, his first was to try and deflect responsibility and argue a semantic point. Now, just because you don't call something by a name, if all the actions equate to that, we call it by that. I can say I'm beating you, but if I sit here and I hit you lightly and I say, no, sorry, all I did was slightly bruise you. It doesn't matter if I slightly bruise you, I still assaulted you. You don't sit here and argue the degree to which that assault, what it was called and all of this. What you do is acknowledge the wrong and the harm. Now, what does this send to Indigenous people who are descendants of these people and Pacific Islanders who are descendants of people who were used as slave labor? What message does it send to them when the leader of the country completely denies their history? And that's what I mean. We weren't taught this. We didn't know any of this.
To add more to that, I think as a teacher as well, looking at the curriculum and what we do deliver in the classroom, you don't later encounter this history until the later stage of your high school. And if you're lucky, and university. I was hit with the Indigenous history in university. This is the extent. So all my assignments were then focused on that, and subjects that I picked were on that because I wanted to learn more, because I was not exposed to it in high school. So if there's no exposure at a young age as to what exactly occurred in Australia to the Indigenous people, it's whitewashed, the curriculum. I disagree with how, some of the things are delivered to these children. Because it's brutal, they can't deliver it to children because it's too sensitive, but it has to be delivered at a stage where these children can pick it up and grow up with it and empathize and be apologetic about what's happened in the past and acknowledge it. So, and this is how it will be instilled in them, because it takes a long time to instill values and understanding into children. So the younger they're exposed to it, the better. So I think as a fault in the system, the curriculum should change and delivered at an early age,
Okay.
basically.
Thank you very much for that. Now, let's talk a moment about leadership, because obviously, when tackling social issue, you do require leadership at both levels. I mean, I'm talking about the general Australian mainstream society level, as well as the minority, the black community. Now, we tend to see a bit of a disconnect or a gap between younger people and older people, and that affects the way that leadership is delivered to tackle some of these big problems that we are facing. What would be some of your thoughts around how to address that, to get a united front from the community to address these type of issues for the interest of everyone involved? Ben.
Yeah.
Okay, Mary,
Okay.
go ahead. Mary, go ahead.
I think I'm lucky to be among the few young Africans that have worked with African leaders. I've worked with Emmanuel Kondok from the Sudanese community and few others. So mostly in our discussion, we always talk about that intergenerational conflict between young and old Africans. There's always this perception from the leader that, of course, the young Africans are not serious enough, or they don't want to involve in community. But from my experience, it's completely different. I've seen young Africans that are active in community development or community participation. They want to work, they're active, they want to involve in community activities. Of course, they want to represent themselves, because most of the things that are happening when it comes to racial profiling, things like that, it affects the young more than the old in Australia. Of course, because the young are active, they're out there in the community, the most times get interaction with the police, and they most times get interaction with the law. So they always want to work. But I think we have to bridge that gap between the young and the old to understand that cultural shift, to understand that cultural shift. Sometimes I say our African leaders need to empower young Africans. They need to get them involved in activities. For example, I work with the African Australian Advocacy Center, which is a new center that we're trying to build up. So one idea is to bring young Africans, especially students from universities, talk to them to be actively involved in that. In that case, they'll be the right advocate for themselves. Because from my experience as a social worker, the best thing to give someone is that self-determination, for them to at least move on, to fight for themselves, to fight for their struggle, to fight for what they want, because they understand what's happening to them. And I was discussing about the issues in Melbourne. A lot of the time I talk to Emmanuel Kondok and few other African leaders, they are blaming the young people. But have we empowered the young people? Do we get
Okay.
them involved in our activities? So there are things that we need to do as Africans, as a community. We need to empower our young people. We need to have things like seminar where community leaders and young people can discuss issues that are affecting our community. In that case, we'll be able to advocate for our community as a whole.
All right. Even empower young people, but if there is not that connection between the older and the younger generation, it's not such an easy job to do. It's easier said than done.
Yeah, I think just to go off what Murray has said, I completely agree with everything he has said. The intergenerational gap makes it difficult. Sorry, that sound is getting crackly. But yeah, the intergenerational gap makes it quite difficult to address issues of racism, not only outside of our community, but within the community. Now, one thing I want to add to this is from my own experience, and again, I don't blame our parents' generation, but from my own experience, when we would come home and we would say, Mum, this kid at school called me the N-word, or this kid did this and I got angry. The first thing they'd say is, what did you do? What did you do to bring this on yourself? Now you're a child. You're sitting there telling Mom, I want you to come, fight for me at school. I want you to come and tell the teachers that this happened and that it's racism. And our parents, because they come from situations where maybe they felt like guests in a country. You know, we were refugees in countries all over Africa, where you essentially, you take the treatment that the host gives you. You know, if people in Egypt were racist to us, you take it on the chin, you go home. You know, so our parents had this attitude of trying to create as little fuss as possible. So which meant that we had to internalize the treatment that we got outside of the home. And our parents, either if they believed us, then they told us to just cop it, or either they tried to question us, almost like victim blaming, like, what did you do to bring it on to you? And you're kind of like, I didn't do anything. I just happened to be black and I was crossing the street, you know? And so we have this thing where our parents have this very conservative, like, be quiet, hold yourself, succeed, go to school, do this, and pay no mind. But racism creates psychological problems, yeah? Experiencing racism. I remember being in primary school, and Cholok, who's my sister, by the way, can attest to this, where we were the first African family in Coffs Harbour, 20 years ago. It's 9 years old, and at school, learning English, learning a new language. And this is where I first heard the term half-caste used by a teacher. And I asked her, what does half-caste mean? And she's like, oh, you know, bit black, bit white. It took me 5 years to learn that word and the history of it was from an oppressive culture. Like, there's no way that you use biracial. You wouldn't say half-caste. And I remember a student coming past with a slight tan, and the teacher saying something like, oh, he's got a brush of the tar in him. That's a reference to them having Aboriginal blood. Now, we had teachers making comments like this. We had lovely teachers, but we even had adults who spoke to us as children like this. And we had trouble being believed at home. So if you try and stand up for yourself at school and you come home, all your parents see is you got detention today for swearing. But they don't see the fact that you got in trouble because you were yelling at someone who called you the N-word, or someone who called you a monkey, or told you to go home. And it builds up. And I remember having this one beautiful teacher, Mr. Cutmore, an Indigenous Australian man who was for Indigenous students at the school. And I had to go to him and explain to him that a kid had just called me the N-word, and it was making me cry because I'm a crybaby. And he turned to me and he said, honey, remember, you know, when they say this stuff to you, say, I'm black and sweet and hard to beat, you know? So I had to go and get support from an Indigenous liaison officer at school, because these weren't issues that our parents and the parents' generation were seeing as a big deal. In their mind, they've copped worse. They've come from war-torn countries. They've survived all of this. And so racism is smaller on the radar, you know, until it becomes a physical sort of situation. And what this creates is anger from the youth, because we feel our parents don't understand what we're trying to do. And at the same time, our parents are like, why are you making so much noise? You know, why are you on TV? Why are you doing this? You're bringing unnecessary attention to us. And so you have this divide where it's kind of like we're on two different tracks, you know? And I find that, you know, it's very demoralizing. It's changing a little bit, but yeah, that's just from personal experience.
Just to extend on Nyeben's point there of the parents taking racism as a small thing. Well, I think when we were in Egypt, because some came through Egypt and some migrated through East Africa, we were in Egypt, so we copped it a lot, and it was physical at times. But when we come to Australia, it's systematic, it's systemic, you know, it's in the system, it's subtle. So our parents, because they've never experienced that, they don't understand it. And this is where I think I'm going with this leadership issue of the intergenerational shift that should occur, and it should have happened maybe 6 or 7 years ago, according to the time the Africans started coming to Australia. The elders should have stepped aside and, you know, recruited these young ones to come in now. And I think we would have been in a better position today had there been a lot of the younger Africans more empowered about 6 or 7 years ago. But it's never too late. I think they can still step aside and let us in. My father has a Bangladeshi friend, and my father's overseas. So I met him 2 years ago, and he said, Sherlock, do you know what your problem is? The African problem is. And I asked him what. And he's like, regarding your leadership. And I asked him, yes, what it is. What is it? You know, and he said, you elect leaders that, not based on their qualification, but based on, you know, their grandfathers, what their grandfather did, you know, what they did in Africa. So, and this is your downfall, and this is why you're not moving forward as a community. And this was in a small town, Coffs Harbour. I think we're all from the North Coast here. Yeah. So that was Coffs Harbour, and when I actually observed, I sat back and I observed what's happened. And it's true. The reason things were not happening is because we've elected people who we just, selected based on the respect for their grandparents or for their father or for their mother, but they didn't have the power, they didn't have the tools, they didn't have the knowledge, they didn't have the information to help counteract or to help battle the issues that the young people were facing, the issues that the single mothers were facing, the issues that, some families were facing or individuals, and these individuals collectively made what the community was. And when there's a collapse on one pole, everything just fell apart, basically. So if the elders can step aside and take the younger generation on, I think something can change. Yeah.
Now, well, I got about 5 minutes left for the show. One thing that I don't always have a chance to discuss is how, and I would like to be able to do it today, is given that all of you are from New South Wales and I'm Melbourne based. When you look at what some of the issues are happening in Melbourne, I see there's been a lot more issues relating to young people misbehaviors here in Melbourne. And doesn't seem to be happening much in New South Wales or other states. What's your take on that? How do you see that? Why is it happening in Melbourne and not so much in Sydney and Perth and other places?
I think, sorry, I seem to be hogging the space here, but I'll be quick, 30 seconds. I think one of the bigger differences is that when we came to New South Wales, our family was sent to Coffs Harbour, where we're the only African family there, yeah? And so the African population, when we were coming, was literally spread all over New South Wales. You had people in towns that I'd never heard of. And so what you had was at least that what you notice is that in places where the populations are concentrated, you have a deficit in services. And so if you're the only African family in town, then you might be able to go and speak to the Migrant Resource Center, which only has you and some Vietnamese family there. You might be able to get help on things like mental health. You might be able to actually speak to someone directly. But as the population grows and the social services are sort of taken away slowly, what you have is a concentration of disenfranchised people in one area, which is what you have in Melbourne and Sydney. And what you have is the perfect storm, young people who are unable to find jobs, and services that are not responsive. You're having to line up 2 hours just to speak to a counselor or something like that. And you have community collapse. There is this collapse between the adults and the young people. Now, you say it didn't happen in New South Wales, but as a New South Wales resident and someone who has been a teenager, we saw all these things. I remember Blacktown, a police officer stomping on a South Sudanese boy's face. That was 2008. I remember police officers harassing me as a teenager on the train, basically because I happened to be with some South Sudanese boys who were with us. These are incidences that happened, but what's happened was the outrage just wasn't there yet, And so Melbourne, where you had a greater concentration of people, where there's also the political divide between the Liberal and the Labor government, you have Liberal governments in New South Wales who are willing to use Victoria as a political football. If they need to win an election, what do? They turn the camera to Melbourne and say, look at these African gangs, So they're not looking into their own backyard of the disenfranchisement of their own African populations. They're looking purely for something that is good advertising for their racism and good advertising for their conservative views. And so I think Melbourne in itself is not necessarily that the crime statistics are even worse than anywhere else. It's that they've been used as a political football over and over and over again. Populations in Western Sydney and ask them, do you have any problems with police interactions here? They would say, hell yes.
I somehow agree with what Leben is saying. If you look at ethnic concentration itself, it's a problem. It's not only with Africans. If you examine the Vietnamese situation in Cabramatta, things like this have happened in the past with the Vietnamese community. So it's not only to the African community. And if you look at our community in Melbourne, is the population, it's higher than New South Wales. Of course, so they have less services. So if I examine Blacktown, for example, where you have the highest Africans or Black Africans in New South Wales, there are more services. Blacktown Council is able to provide more services for young Africans. I've been involved with some of those young Africans. They have great services that can be able to engage them. So if you look at the case in Melbourne, it's not the same in Melbourne. So this creates the problem. I think that's something that they need to discuss between the African community in Melbourne. And also they need to empower Africans to solve their problem. In the case you have less African mental health workers to get involved. You have less African social workers to tap into those communities. Most of the services are provided by mainstream organizations, which makes it difficult for people to access.
Yeah, just to extend on that, and I think you've touched upon it before.
Yeah, just
Sorry, the
brief
crackling
if you
is really
can.
bad.
We're running out of time. Go ahead.
Yeah, you've touched upon it before, and it's the multiculturalism. Diversifying the workplace, I think, would help a lot in this situation. It would have helped in Melbourne. These children need to see people that they can identify with in the services where they want to use. You know, should you want to go into Centrelink, should you want to seek counselling, be able to find an African counsellor because they would understand where they are coming from. So diversifying the workplace, I think, would be the best approach today in tackling what Melbourne. I think you've all said everything else that has to be said about the Melbourne issue, but diversifying the workplace is the only solution.
Maybe just one question we're taking from the audience. Ayuel Bol says, what action can we take as African collective to shift the struggle of First Nations on this land we occupy as refugee settlers? What action can we take as African for a collective shift of the struggle? Nyiben, do you wanna take that one?
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think Murray should take this question actually as someone who has worked with young people and sort of empowering young people. But the only thing that I can add to this is more engagement with our First Nation brothers and sisters. We have to create greater community linkages. But in terms of actually making that happen, I think Murray can speak to that experience better than I can.
Okay, Murray, maybe quickly, what can you say?
Something that during the protest, this is something that I was thinking about, because I didn't see much involvement from the African community in the Black Lives Matters protest. That's something that I question. I saw a lot of young Africans, but not a community as a whole. We have too many organizations in African organizations in New South Wales, but we are not involved with the indigenous community. We don't understand their history. We don't have that connection with them. These are things that we need to establish. We need to establish connection with them. We need to share that history, share and common interest. I think in that way we'll be able to empower ourselves to fight or advocate for our people.
I believe the younger generation will be able to connect in the arts part, dancing, creative arts, drama. They should all get along in those fields, and I think that's one way of coming together as we identify and we have such practices as well. So
okay. Thank you very much, Nyiben, Nam, Mari, Cholok. Thank you for taking the time to discuss this matter with us here on Afroshine Live. We would want to continue this conversation. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. I suppose this is the first time, maybe not first time for Nyiben, but the two of you. But we would want to get more people from New South Wales and other states to be a part of this conversation, because it's important that we hold a community conversation around important issues that affect all of us, and look at ways we can potentially, build some synergy to find solutions to all these issues. So keep on doing whatever you are doing, and keep watching AMA and sharing our videos, and we will get you again back next time for more on this matter or any other issues in the community. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Good night, guys.
Good night.
Bye-bye.